Okay, well, we're in the third part of Paul's discussion of the Jew-Gentile problem, and I just entitled this one, Romans 11, the grafting in of the Gentiles. And he has discussed this because this was a major concern, I'm certain, to his own heart, to the Spirit's heart, because the Spirit is revealing to him what to say here, and certainly to the heart of the Jew and Gentile as they are together in the church. And I don't guess we can even come close to understanding how unusual that might have been in the first century, to have Jew and Gentile together. Most of us grew up during a time when we were already, getting past probably the time of racial tension in this country. We may have grown up during that time of racial tension, and we might have some idea of what it would be like to have whites and blacks actually worship together in places that had traditionally never done that before. You may have even been part of something like that. I don't know. I certainly wasn't. But it is a situation where the grafting in of the Gentiles was of great concern, not just because of these two very opposite, so to speak, races coming together in one body, but because of a theological problem. How did this happen? And is God forgetting about his elect, chosen people, the Jews? Is he giving up on them? What really happened in all of this situation? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at that today. And in chapter, I wish we could read the whole chapter, but for time's sake we're not going to be able to do that. But at the beginning of chapter 11, he says in verse 1, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? And what he means by that is his people according to the flesh, of the descendancy of Abraham. And he says, may it never be, for I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So he even gives a tribal affiliation here, so that they'll understand that he, fleshly speaking, is connected to Abraham through the tribe of Benjamin, who was one of the sons of Jacob, and then his father is Isaac, and his father is Abraham. So he says, no, that's not true. God has not rejected every one of his people. That's not true. And so he gives an example that he is one of them, of the flesh, that is a believer. And so I think one of the big things that we have to understand is there are times in the history of the world that it looks like that there's just widespread unbelief. And you get to the point sometimes when you think, wow, is there anyone who really, truly believes anymore? And I'm not saying we're in that time period now. But I'm just saying that God has always had a remnant of those who believe. And think about it. I mean, of all of those unworthy people that were listed in the beginning of the Bible, Enoch walked with God. All right? With all of those people that were horribly violent and God-haters during the time of Noah, Noah and his family found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And then, of course, what example does he use? There was a prophet in the Old Testament.
Elijah.
That's Elijah. And basically, what did Elijah say one time when he was being chased around Israel by Jezebel?
He thought he was the only one.
I gotta be the only one left. Father, I'm the only one left. This is after a big, huge victory, at Mount Carmel, where the prophets of Baal were just snuffed out, and God was obviously vindicated, and so was his prophet Elijah, and yet he's running for his life. And so Elijah must have felt like, well, here I did this amazing miracle through God's power, and yet nobody's believing. I'm the only one left. And God comforts him, and in a little bit, I think, kind of instructs him no, Elijah, you're not the only one. I have 7,000 who have not gone over to idolatry and have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so he uses himself as an example of one who truly is an Israelite by the flesh and truly is one of God's chosen elect people. And on the other side, he uses this idea that God has always had a remnant of those who believe. Okay? And when you see the horrible disbelief or unbelief right before the destruction of Jerusalem, don't forget about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Don't forget about those. There are people like that all the time. In the face of all of that ridiculous injustice that was going on in Jerusalem at that time, Daniel was a young prince. He was a noble. And he didn't believe in that junk. He was a true God believer. And boy, was his faith tested when he was taken away in the first captivity, and he survived it. So recognize that that's always going to be the case. And when the people were taken away, there was still a remnant that believed, and there was still a remnant that returned. And by faith, they rebuilt that temple and set up the worship again in that area, and then they continued on. And by faith, they recognized their tribal identity and restored that tribal identity. And from that point on, all the way to the time of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, then Mary and Joseph both knew their tribal identity. That they were from the tribe of Judah, and that they were descended from people who were in Bethlehem. And they knew how to get there. And so God brings this about. God brings that about. So in what he says in verse 5, in the same way then there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. And this remnant, he's not speaking of the Gentiles here. He is speaking of those among the Jews, because what does it look like during that time about the Jews and Jesus Christ?
Well, the Jews have all fallen away. They're all in unbelief.
Yeah, it appears that they've all just rejected him. You know, and in a whole-scale sense, you can say that that's true. But there are pockets of believers all over the place. And in fact, you know that to be true, because how did the first church begin? Was it a Gentile church? No. Well, the first 3,000 that were saved on the day of Pentecost were all Jews. And were they only from Jerusalem or Israel? No. Where were they from, basically?
All over.
Yeah, all over the Roman world. Okay, so then it was years later that Peter went to the first Gentile and spoke to him the words of God, Cornelius. So obviously God has not rejected his people. That notion is not the case. Okay? He hasn't rejected every one of them. However, something had to happen. Okay? And this is where I think we get into this point where we think, what is God doing to people? What is he doing? But you have to read the whole chapter, and you have to get the whole sense of this. He says, what then? What Israel is seeking, verse 7, it is not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Here's this hardening again, okay? And then he chooses a couple of Old Testament passages to help us understand the hardening that was going to happen. The first one in verse 8, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. What does the word stupor mean?
Confusion.
Okay, confusion. All right. Does anybody have another translation there? Okay. All right, so he says God gave them this spirit of confusion so that they would not see. Now, do you guys remember anything about Jesus saying that at any time in his ministry, that for you, he said to his disciples, for you it has been granted that you would see these things, but for them it has not. And then he starts reeling off Old Testament passages of Scripture as well. Okay, turn over, sorry about my voice this morning. Turn over to Matthew. And get over to the 13th chapter. Now this is not the same one that Paul uses, but Jesus uses this. And remember, he spoke to them in a parable, and he spoke to them about the sower. It's the parable of the sower going out to sow. Okay? And then verse 9 says, he who has ears, let him hear. And then the disciples say, Jesus, why do you do that? Why do you always speak in parables? Why don't you just say it out? Well, why don't you just say the words? Okay? And what was his explanation? Because it's been given to you to understand it, and it's not been given to them. But why? The underlying message there is why. Why had it been given to the disciples and not been given to the scribes and Pharisees who were constantly coming to Jesus to pick at him and tempt him and test him?
Well, they were hearing the same thing. I mean, it wasn't that Jesus wasn't saying the same words. He was saying different words to the apostles, different words to them. They were saying the same things. It's their hearts. It goes back to the parable of the sower. The heart was in a different spot. And the Pharisees were, Nicodemus, although by night, came to Jesus. His heart was willing. His heart was fertile, ready to accept. These were not.
Okay, so understand that the hardening that occurred to Israel was not this business of God, and Calvinistic thought is going to say this. It's not this business of God looking down upon certain people and say, I will harden their hearts, and I will soften their hearts, and that's how I'm going to manipulate mankind. It's Jesus said, he who has ears, let him hear. The disciples weren't hardened because they had ears to hear. In other words, they had a soft heart that was open. The Pharisees were hardened because did they come to really listen to the words of life? No. What was their whole purpose for coming to listen to Jesus?
Well, they were jealous of him, so they wanted to find ways to trap him and hopefully even get rid of him. Okay?
They wanted to kill him. So obviously, that tells us something about how we listen to people, doesn't it? Okay? We have to be people who listen, because if you walk in and you have this predisposed notion about somebody or about what they're going to say to you, then whoa, you're going to get like what the Jews did to Stephen. They listened to him for a while, they put up with it for a while, and then they just gnashed their teeth, they grabbed their ears, they went crazy on him, and they stoned him to death. That was it. That was it. Okay, because they didn't have those ears to hear, but those of Pentecost did. All right, so this passage here that he says, Jesus, in verse 14, in this case, the prophecy, or in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled. You will keep on hearing, but you won't understand. You will keep on seeing, but you will not perceive. Your heart has become dull. Your ears scarcely hear. You have closed your eyes. Otherwise, you would see with your eyes, hear with your ears, understand with your heart, return, and I would heal you. But you stopped up your eyes and ears and everything else. And so back to Romans 11 now. The fact that God sent them prophets to teach them really hardened the people's heart, much like the way Pharaoh's heart was hardened. When the prophet Moses came to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," this man was an arrogant man who wasn't going to listen to that at all. And so as a result of that, he simply said, "No, I'm going to stop my ears to that." And so they were given a spirit of stupor, to see not and ears to hear not. Okay? So then, he continues on, but he says he's going to get to this point next, that the hardening of Israel allowed for the Gentiles to be grafted in. And that's going to be a difficult point, I think, to understand. A lot of people are going to say, well, why? Why did that have to happen in order for the Gentiles to be grafted in? And I think we'll be able to explain that this morning to your satisfaction. Maybe, I don't know. But look at the next verse here. He says, verse 11, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? How is Jesus Christ a stumbling block to people? Because oftentimes he's prophesied to be, he's the choice cornerstone, to be the rock, and to be the cornerstone, to be the foundation of the building. But in what way is he a stumbling block?
Well, I think to the Jews he was a stumbling block because he was just in their way, because he wasn't what they had pictured the Messiah to be. So he caused them to stumble because he wasn't what they had been taught through the generations was going to happen when the Messiah came.
Okay. And is he a stumbling block today to people for exactly the same reason?
Sure.
Yeah, that guy gets in my way. You know, he sits there like this big rock, you know, or this block of something, and he gets in my way. And I'm not willing to go. I'm not willing to accept that. So there was a partial stumbling. However, according to Paul, what does he say right there? Verse 11, they didn't all stumble so as to what? As to fall. Not every one of them fell. If there may have been a beginning stumbling there by the Jews, but they all didn't fall because of him. There were some that got back up and dusted themselves off, so to speak, just like some will do today. Have you ever noticed anybody that the first time they're talked to about Jesus Christ, they're resisting? Maybe you were one of those. Just a total resistance. And yet later, you acquiesced to him. So you stumbled at first, but you did not fall. Thoughts about that? Does that make sense to you? Yes, Tom?
I think what I was thinking of before you brought that up, but I think it ties right in with that, is that how many times Paul is using himself as an example through this and looking at his experience with regard to, I mean, God didn't change the gospel to change his heart. His heart changed, so the very same gospel that enraged him and made him go out to kill believers, that very same gospel totally converted his heart to Jesus Christ when his heart was in a different place. So I think, you know, it has a lot of application as we share the gospel with people. You know, the fact that they're getting angry or totally rejecting it right now doesn't mean that tomorrow, when their heart is in a different place, that very same message is going to become to them their salvation.
Exactly. That's a great point. I mean, Paul's a great example of that. One who stumbled at Jesus Christ in the beginning, and yet he didn't fall. He later accepted him. So, yeah, Jenny?
My Bible in verse 11 doesn't say all. It doesn't say, have they all stumbled.
I'm sorry. I should not have said that.
Okay. Here's what it says. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? I guess I've always seen that as, have they stumbled for the purpose of falling? And then later he says, certainly not, but through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. That the purpose of their fall, the purpose of their stumbling, was salvation being open to the Gentiles.
Yeah, and
that's what has tripped me up.
Yeah, that
that's
segues
where I
into
say,
the
well,
next
that's
part.
not cool. That they had to fall. That's what has always seemed manipulated.
Oh, okay, and there's where I think we need to get. Let's read it from the New American Standard and then go on here, because I think this is really important, and this is where I said I think it's going to be a little hard for us to grasp. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? Okay, now, Paul does not tell the specifics of how God decided to make them jealous. This is what I think I've struggled with in chapter 11. When I ask myself the question, well, how did he make them jealous? I guess I know that in a general sense. I know that the Jews got jealous, but I have to kind of backtrack here, and I have to kind of think, okay, so how were the Jews jealous? Well, isn't this the point that Paul's been trying to make all along through the Old Testament that a lot of Jews didn't get? That God's eternal plan and his final plan was to bring all nations in? Okay, and isn't that the thing that they just went ballistic over? You know, I don't think they're going to be able to handle this kind of thing. This is what they stumbled at. In fact, even in the early church, did they not stumble at the fact of having Jew and Gentile on an equal standing? Of course they did. That was very, very difficult. Leah.
So were they jealous of somebody else getting saved, or were they jealous of not being the only ones being saved?
I think it's more the second than the first. Because
Okay.
I don't think they would have a problem if somebody proselyted in as a Gentile and came into their Judaism and believed all the Jewish things that they believed. So most of them seemed to
But the
think that
problem
was
was that they
okay.
weren't more special.
Yeah, they were upset that they were
Right.
no longer God's chosen race.
Right,
Not God's
right.
chosen
If God's
people.
chosen race is now going to be anybody that's
Yeah.
uncircumcised, are you kidding me? You know, I think there's the jealousy, okay, and that's the stumble. Yes.
Well, I think plus they always viewed others as having mistreated them. So,
Okay.
God, you're going to be gracious to those people who mistreated us, like Jonah.
And, yeah, had a Jonah attitude, God, you're going to be gracious to those people who believe in idols. You know, even though they forgot in their history, they did the same thing. Your fathers did very much the same thing. Now, after the exile, when they came back, no, they didn't. No graven image idolatry ever again. You know, now they had idolatry in their mind and in their heart, but they didn't have graven image idolatry. They were going to set up some sort of idol. They were going to set up calf worship. So I think it doesn't take much more deduction than to just say, and if we go beyond that, I think we're going to get into a lot of areas that we just really don't know. I think he makes them jealous because he's selecting in other people. And so when he comes in and does that, there's a partial hardening of Israel. They're really getting upset about this. Their first reaction is, no, this cannot be this cannot be so. But not all of them did fall in that. Some accepted that. Embraced it, in fact. And even Jesus prophesied of it in John the 10th chapter when he says, other sheep I have. I have other sheep. And I will call them. And they will match together and they will become one fold. And so he prophesies the coming in of the Gentiles as well. All right, so the hardening of Israel occurred because God's plan unfolded to the point where I believe now all of a sudden his full plan is being revealed and they got hardened. Because if somebody had said that, I guess back in the days of the Persian kings and the Persian rule over the Jew, I would guess they would be hardened right then. But what happened is now you have a people that are really, really getting far, far away from God by the time Jesus comes. Remember John the Baptist came for what reason?
Call them to
Bear the
repentance.
light.
Yes, to call these people to repentance. He had to pave the way. Jesus just didn't come without John coming first. We had to get somebody in there and soften up these people, shake them up a bit. And was John the Baptist the normal, dude running around, Jewish phylactery guy? No, he wasn't. He was a radical person that wake up. you've got to get your hearts back to the God of your fathers. Wake up. And so he's trying to get them ready for Jesus. So their hearts were way far away. Well, you get them way far away, and then all of a sudden, this is when God has planned to reveal that he's going to bring in the Gentiles. Yeah. You can see how that would harden. Okay. Joel, and then Wes.
Just it goes back, just even John the Baptist goes to the unsearchable knowledge of God that John the Baptist was foretold of too. This wasn't something that God wrote, oh, I better take care of this now because I got Jesus coming here in another couple of years. Right. I know they're not ready. I knew you weren't going to be ready thousands of years ago.
Right. Right. And so he prophesied about him. Wes.
Well, to me, it seems like it's saying God gave them. I mean, it says God gave them a spirit of stupor. You know, it doesn't say because of the situation their hearts were more hardened than they were before. They were jealous. I mean, to me, it seems like God gave them that, or that God allowed them not to hear, or made it so that they could not hear. You know, I mean, it just doesn't seem like they were stubborn and they didn't want to hear. I mean, that sounds good, and I like that better. But it's just not what it seems like it says.
Okay.
The same thing with Pharaoh too. You know.
Yeah. But if you look at, that's why I brought you to Matthew, or took you to Matthew 13. If you look at Matthew 13, the better explanation of this prophecy right here is this passage that says, you will keep on hearing, but you will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but you will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal him. And remember, Wes, in the same verse, this is when Jesus says, verse 11, in the same hearing of these disciples, to you it has been granted, but to them it has not been granted. Okay, so those words sound like God is just choosing those that are going to receive and choosing those that will not receive it. But truly, what it is in the context of a group of people who have refused to hear him. Okay? And so one of the things that we don't have so much time to do in this class, but when you look at the idea of God's election and the election of his people, there is always recognized that as far as this sometimes is called God's choice, always recognize that God can make some choices on his own as a sovereign being that will have nothing to do with your personal salvation. In other words, he can choose to bring the Christ at the time of the Roman kings, which he did, and he prophesied that he would do. And that has nothing to do with my personal salvation, okay? But in another sense, God's elect people or chosen people are those that have been foreknown by him before the foundation of the world, according to Romans 8. They were foreknown that they would be of a certain type of people that would then accept him. So I've always used this analogy. When the architect, drew out this doorway right here, only this door and every other door meeting this specification will fit. So this door is foreknown. Okay, but I don't think the architect knew the door personally in the sense of knowing, if this door had a name, Charles. This is Charles here. He doesn't have that there. He doesn't. All he did was draw out these specifications. So in that sense, the door is foreknown. Now, if we go on in chapter 11, look at how. If we go on, look what he says here. Verse 23. Well, verse 22. And I'm going to jump ahead just for this purpose so that we can kind of, bring more clarity to this discussion. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell severity, but to you God's kindness. If you continue in his kindness, Otherwise, you will also be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in. See, the verse 20 then here, quite right, they were broken off for their what? Their unbelief. Okay, so in the Old Testament, this is a really interesting idea. In the Old Testament, in the wilderness, who was stated in Hebrews to be a group of people that had unbelief?
The Israelites.
The Israelites. Isn't that kind of weird to think about that? What did they see?
Miracle after miracle after miracle. Parting of the Red Sea, all of it.
Yeah. They saw the 10 plagues on Egypt. They saw God bringing them out by a mighty hand. They saw the Red Sea parted. They see what happens at the Ten Commandment Mountain. And they see the pillar of cloud by day and... Am I getting it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fire.
And by fire by night. Okay, they see all this every day, and yet there are people of unbelief. Hebrews clearly states that they fell because of their unbelief. This is interesting to me, because if you ask any one of them, do you believe that there's a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? They go, yes, of course, you know. But how are they a people of unbelief? I'm not listening to you.
Yeah, they denied the truth.
I'm not going to listen to you. I don't want to hear the truth. I don't want to hear that I'm going to eat manna every day. I don't want to hear it. I want to go back to Egypt. So in that sense, they were given a spirit of stupor, I see. They were given a hardened heart. They were hardened. God granted it to them, too. Because he's going to let you. I think for those of you that were at Andrew's funeral, I thought, you know, Bill did just such a wonderful job when he stated to all of those people there, all the things that God will do. He will always, always, always give you a choice. It will be your choosing. And sometimes we just choose not to do things that are dangerous, and or choose things to do that are dangerous. We just make choices in our lives, and we pay consequences for those choices. Okay? And God's not going to, erase those choices that we make any more than we can erase His choice. Wow. So much more in this chapter, but these are great discussions. I want us to continue on. Let's blog about it this week and talk about it again. Verse 15, if their rejection is reconciliation for the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? He said, wow, let me tell you something. If in their jealousy and rejection and partial hardening of their heart, or temporary hardening of the heart, and they just go, I can't believe that the Gentiles are actually going to be the chosen people of God without being circumcised in the flesh? Are you kidding me? If that brought about the reconciliation of the world, he says, guess what's going to happen if they turn and believe? Wow, that's going to be awesome. It's going to be life from the dead. And he says, recognize this, the first piece of dough is holy, and the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. Now, what's his warning to the Gentiles in this chapter about the grafting in?
Don't be proud.
Yeah. Don't you dare get arrogant. Now the Gentiles come in and say, well, I was a wild olive branch grafted in, I'm now chosen of God, and you guys aren't even accepting Him. Whoa. There's a warning given there about that. And he says this idea here, quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. If God did not spare the natural branches, He will not spare you either. Okay? And then he goes on to say, according to a farmer, which is going to be easier to graft into the original tree trunk? The natural olive, not the wild. The wild olive is going to take some doing. You know, I don't know if you know anything about grafting in. I know about this much of it, you know. But I can just see putting that graft on that tree with the wild olive, taping that thing around and everything else, and you know, growing it and this and that, and looking at that branch every day thinking, it's not going to grow, it's not going to grow, it's not going to grow, it's not sprouting anything. And it's going to take a long, long time. I got a rose one time, and I thought, that rose is dead. So I called up the company, and I said, please send me another rose. And they have this unconditional guarantee. We'll send you another rose. And they sent me another rose. I planted it in the ground. Just stayed there for 3 months. It just... Okay, well, that was 20 years ago, and I still have the rose. It grew. All of a sudden, it just came out. And it's kind of a lesson to me. It just needed some patience there. But a lot of patience grafting into Gentiles out there. A whole lot of patience that had to be done. Just look at the Corinthian church. You had a lot of patience with that. Yes, Joe.
Grafting is a lot like seeds or even something you're familiar with, transplants. Sometimes they don't take.
Right.
And it's not the plant's fault, it's not the graft's fault, it's sometimes it just doesn't take.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So here he gets to verse 25. He says, I don't want you, brethren, to be uninformed about this mystery. Now, what's a mystery in the Bible, especially in the New Testament? I don't want you to be confused about this. Give me a definition of mystery in the New Testament.
Unveiling.
I think it's just something that's veiled right now. It hasn't been revealed yet.
Oh, okay. But to the mind of the apostles, it is now revealed.
Right.
It was once the mystery of God, or it was veiled, and now it is unveiled, because that's what the apostles are doing. So for those who haven't heard yet, it's still a mystery. So he's saying, I don't want you to be uninformed about this mystery, so that you'll be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. In what sense? Don't forget what he's already said about all Israel. All Israel is not Israel of the flesh, is it? So when God says all Israel is going to be saved, he's talking about every one of his elected people, his chosen people. How many of them are going to be saved? Every one of them. All of us. And you might be going, what? Can't we fall? That's not that. You just said that. He said you could. He said you could go into unbelief and fall. That's not the point. Everyone that fits the specifications of the door are selected, they're chosen, and they are God's. Okay? It has to happen, because God is not going to lose any of them. He's too powerful to lose any of them. And that's why this next point is very important. However, God's choice of believing Jews stands. Okay? They did believe, some of them, and they will stand. And they are elected. And they are holy. And they're the root. They're the root of the tree that you got grafted in on. Tom?
I think something that I overlooked for a long time as a Christian was our connection. Like this picture right here ends with all of us being grafted into a tree whose root is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of that Old Testament history. So it's in the same sense that if we were adopted into a family that could trace its roots back to however long, and we're very, very reverent of their history, and then say we're adopted in and we're a Heinz 57, have no clue what our heritage is, but now that we're adopted into that family, now that becomes our rich heritage, and we're a part of that. And I think that the concept of me having now all that Old Testament heritage as being personally my family tree, because I've been grafted into that, it really opens up an appreciation for Old Testament study, because I'm studying my family history. I'm not studying something that God on the cross balled up and threw in the trash can. I'm studying something that God has preserved, even though some have been broken off because of unbelief. That tree is still consistent, and all the blessings that God has brought to me have been through the means of all of that Old Testament development and history. And it just really, to me, it gives a whole new perspective to my relationship to the Old Testament.
That's a beautiful perspective, too. And I don't think I thought of it in that way before, this idea of being connected to Abraham in that way. But with this analogy, he is the root of my wild olive branch, being grafted in. So I have a great connection with all of them as well. Well, he says in verse 28, from the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoints of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And what he means by that is just simply this. God has predetermined certain things to be so. He's not going to change those. Okay? He predetermines what the gospel message is going to be. He predetermines who's going to bring that message. He predetermines that his son is going to be the main speaker of that message. He predetermines that the Jewish people, circumcised people, are going to be brought about, in order to bring about his plan. He predetermines that some of them are going to harden their hearts over what he's going to say and what he's going to do in the process of bringing every nation in. All of those things have been predetermined. Okay? And those choices and that calling, that's irrevocable. He's not going to revoke that. And so what I have to do is I have to acquiesce to this predetermination. I can fight against it. I can stumble over it. I can even fall. I can resist it. I can get angry about it. But really and truly, this is what Paul's trying to tell those Jews. Don't be. Don't be, because you can just get all angry about this, and it's not going to change. Because God's choice in this matter is going to stand. And here's the good news. You Jews by the flesh, he can make you stand as well. By your belief in Jesus Christ, he can make you stand as well. So then, Paul ends this second part with a grand finale once more in verses 33 to 36. And he just praises God. Oh, the depth and the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has first given to him that he might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. The word unfathomable is a great word, because the way that sailors figure out how much water is underneath them so that they won't run their ship aground is to take a sounding. And the sound goes down to the water, and if I'm remembering correctly, it travels much faster in water than it does in air. And it goes down in the water and hits the bottom of the ocean floor or bottom of the river floor or whatever it is, and it comes back up. Okay, and then it lets them know about how deep it is. When you try to do that with God's riches, you take a little, noise thing and you go boom, it goes down, it doesn't come back. It doesn't hit a floor. It's so deep. That's the depth of his riches and his unmeasured grace to us. Wisdom and knowledge, all of this, bringing all of this together. And then we see a division in the book for next week. because up to this point, it's the doctrine and the theology and the grace, the gospel. And now we're going to see application of the doctrine, the theology, and all of this. Alicia?
You seem to really like this chapter, and I think for many of us, this is a very difficult chapter. And I think this principle is the reason that this is delving into something really difficult. The idea that God can interact in human history and not actually determine your history, is a difficult concept for a finite mind to understand. And I think that is apparent in Paul's reasoning here. He's putting things that seem paradoxical together, but I think what helps me is understanding that all through the chapter, God's goal really is the acceptance of the Jew as well, not the rejection. He's not determining it. But I do think this is a really I think that this concept of God using humans to fulfill his purpose, but he's not using them like they're not robots. He's not determining their fate. When he does that, is difficult for us because we're not capable of that.
If somebody were to ask me, and this is, even though I really get into chapters 9, 10, and 11, I love to study those. I'm in agreement with you about that. If someone were to ask me where the hardest chapters in the Bible for me to teach or explain, I would not say Revelation. I would say these 3 chapters in Romans. I think that they are the most difficult. I think they are the most difficult to grasp. And what that means is get into it, folks. Because a 45-minute class here today, where we scratch the surface a little bit, is not going to be enough. And of course, this entire class hopefully has been designed so that you guys will get, a taste of something that you just cannot stop eating. It's like a Lay's potato chip. You just get one. You keep going back to Romans again and again and again, and it becomes yours after a while. Okay? You got it. Yes?
Verse 23, though, has got to give us a lot of hope on multiple levels.
Yes.
We talked about the Calvinistic doctrine, and we've talked about some of the things, and once saved, always saved. Here's a perfect example from the very beginning, that there was no once saved, always saved. But in dealing with, and because I work in LA, I deal with a lot of Orthodox Jews, my customers. And this passage this week has given me a greater hope in the regrafting. And the fact that if they can see this, they will understand. If I could just get them to read Romans, they will understand. I may be naive on that, but this has given me a new sense of evangelism with that group of people, because there is hope in verse 23.
Well, and with what Tom said too, you can, have a connection with them in a way that you have to recognize that I'm indebted to your race of people for what, God did through you. Or I would not be, a believer today. So that's a really good point, Tom.
I think right there is one aspect of God moving them to jealousy, in a sense. In the sense that if they see Lee rejoicing in a close personal relationship with Yahweh that they don't have, and he's saying, I got this through your heritage, isn't that going to move them to say, man, that's for me. This guy's enjoying it on a level that I'm not. That's going to move them, hopefully, to say, I want in.
I hope so. Okay, guys, next week, chapter 12. Very different in chapter 12 when we start talking about practical application. Does then tell how God can take a sinful and fallen creation and bring him back. And it gives assurance to you as the believer that God's love is going to cause all things to work together for his people who are called according to his purpose. Let's have a great class, guys, okay? Next week, chapter 1. Don't forget to read throughout the book. Thank you. Oh, by the way.